Hey there, welcome back to Context is Key. I am still Sam Badias, and I am still going to be your host for this week, where we talk about something that's a little more niche than last time, but it's still something you may have heard about over the past summer. Today we're going to talk about the Gulf Cooperation Council. So, what's the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC for short, because I love acronyms? It was formed in 1981, just after the Iranian Revolution, and while the Iran-Iraq War was happening very near those countries in the GCC. It is made up of Saudi Arabia, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. These 6 countries all share some similar forms of government. According to the BBC, they are autocratic monarchies or sheikdoms and generally don't really let their subjects have much say in the direction of their countries. The goal of the GCC is to encourage economic cooperation between its member states and hopes to protect them from terrorism or other states. That second bit seems like it hasn't been the most successful to me because, you know, Iraq kind of definitely invaded Kuwait in 1990. And last but not least, between these 6 countries, they have nearly half of the entire world's oil reserves, which is pretty important. So why am I talking about this? You may remember earlier this year there was some, albeit not a whole lot, of coverage of what some news outlets were calling a diplomatic crisis between some of the members of the GCC. Now, the US would have cared regardless because of all the oil I mentioned, plus we have allies in the region, but we may not have heard so much about the whole dispute had it not been for these tweets from President Trump that I'll talk about more when we get to that part, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with the basics. So what happened here? Well, on June 5th, 3 of the GCC countries, plus Egypt, announced a diplomatic break with Qatar. There would also be a blockade of Qatar, which isn't great for them because they are a small peninsula and have to import a good part of their goods. The 4 countries released statements accusing Qatar of supporting Islamist political groups, specifically those like Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, who are seen as a group that could lead to a more legitimate form of militant Islam. It also appears that Qatar has been supporting Islamist fighters in Libya and Syria in an attempt to expand their reach outside their immediate region. Now, the fact that Qatar is supporting Islamist groups may have been the main reason given for the split, but there are other factors at play here. Qatar is a small nation, like look at it compared to Saudi Arabia. It's not a huge place, but it's a wealthy nation because it's got oil and natural gas. The Qatari government also seems to be attempting to expand their sphere of influence throughout the aforementioned funding of specific groups, but also through the media. Qatar is the sponsor of the company Al Jazeera, which is a widely viewed TV channel that governments of the region don't super appreciate. Al Jazeera is more than a little controversial in the region. In the past, the network has supported dissent and democracy, which is fine if you believe in freedom of speech in the press, but not when you're one of those autocratic rulers in the GCC. Now, don't get me wrong, Al Jazeera does some really good reporting. I've used them as a source in other videos, but not this one. No matter how interesting their reporting is, they are still a state-sponsored media company, so they aren't probably going to be the best source for this specific topic, or any topic that involves Qatar being at odds with other countries in the GCC or the region at large. There is also the ever-pervasive issue of Iran. Now, Saudi Arabia and Iran are not on the best of terms. There are really not a whole lot of situations where they get along. They're competitors in the oil market, they support different groups in the civil war in Syria, and Saudi Arabia is Sunni and Iran is Shia. Saudi Arabia is accusing Qatar of being too friendly with Iran because Iran also supports some of those same Islamist groups that Qatar is being accused of supporting. From the Saudi side, it does look a little bit like Qatar is trying to play both sides and is preventing a united Sunni shield against Shia Iran. The Qatari relationship with Iran also threatens Saudi Arabia's status as a major power in the region, while from the Qatari side, they are just trying to utilize their resources to maximize their role on the world stage, which, I mean, they aren't the only country that does that. As of right now, this seems like a pretty regional issue, but because of the nature of the world, of course it can't be that simple. The US was bound to get involved regardless of the president's tweeting, because the US has a very important military base there. The Al Udeid Air Base is home to approximately 10,000 US troops and is the regional headquarters for US Central Command. This is a really important base for a lot of reasons, but the fact that it permits US forces to work closely and more directly with regional partners in counterterrorism makes it pretty important for us. However, this isn't the first time other countries in the GCC have had diplomatic issues with Qatar. Back in 2014, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain all withdrew their ambassadors from Qatar over Qatar's support of a Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt. Sound familiar? While the UAE and Saudi Arabia helped to finance the government's overthrow, so clearly those two wouldn't be super fond of opposition from within their cooperation council, because that's not super cooperative. So, you know, it's not like this sort of spat is unheard of or earth-shattering in the region, but it's also not nothing, and people in the US know that. On June 5th, the first day of this whole thing, Secretary of Defense James Mattis and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson both came out to try to smooth things over. Secretary Tillerson, being the top diplomat over at the State Department, offered to play a role in resolving the problem, and Secretary Mattis made a statement saying that the dispute wouldn't impact the current military actions against ISIS, ISIL, the Islamic State, whatever you want to call it. Then, literally less than 12 hours after these officials made policy statements, the president started tweeting. The New York Times reported that a senior White House official said that the sudden change in U.S. policy was not in response to actual deliberation, and it just got everyone real confused. There were 5 tweets in the whole deal, 2 of them dealing with the president's distaste for what he terms fake mainstream media. But this one, which he tweeted at about 5 in the morning, really started the party. A little bit later that morning, the president tweeted that it was, quote, "so good to see the Saudi Arabia visit with the king and 50 other countries already paying off. They said they would take a hard line on funding," and then about 10 minutes later finished up with, quote, "extremism," and all reference was pointing to Qatar. "Perhaps this will be the beginning of the end to the horror of terrorism." The fact that the president straight up singled out Qatar was surprising because now lots of people weren't super clear on what U.S. policy was, and as I already mentioned, it's not like Qatar is just some country that's unimportant to U.S. relations. Now, according to a White House statement later that night on a phone call with the King of Saudi Arabia, the president emphasized the importance of cooperation between Gulf states to stability in the region and in the fight against radical ideologies. This crisis also concerns people. When things were first happening, there was concern that families were going to be separated, and in some cases, people lost their jobs. In this region, lots of people move within the GCC for work, and plenty of families are made up of people of different nationalities. Human rights group Amnesty International reported a case in which a Saudi man was living in Qatar with his Qatari wife, and that this dispute left him unable to visit his seriously ill mother back in Saudi Arabia. Qatari students in neighboring countries were told they had 14 days to get back to Qatar, right before many were due to be starting finals. That blockade that I mentioned briefly earlier is also far more likely to hurt your everyday person than someone who would have had an active role in causing or perpetuating the conflict. These are real people who are suffering and facing incredibly difficult decisions regarding their families and livelihoods. I just wanted to make sure I brought this up because I think we can have a tendency to think too much about the people in power and what they're saying. It's important to remember that these decision makers aren't the only people who matter. We can't forget the citizens who are being impacted on a daily basis. So yeah, I picked this topic for a couple of reasons. One was because I was already following as the events unfolded back in June as part of a project I was working on, but I thought it was a really good example of how no issue is truly local. These countries are on the opposite side of the world, but the crisis began over one nation funding groups about 1,000 miles away, among other things. And then, because the U.S. has a large military installation in Qatar, the federal government got involved because the U.S. is a global power, but also to protect our own interests 7,500 miles away from our borders. The world is getting smaller, and it would take quite the disaster to keep that trend from continuing, so pay attention. Even if something may not seem like it could immediately impact you, it very easily could. Stay sharp, and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much for watching. This episode was produced by Leyland Torres and myself, filmed by the wonderful Leyland Torres, and edited and written by me. Again, a thank you to both Drs. Cruz and Solomon for agreeing to work with me on this adventure of a thesis project.